I'm Sigrid Wright. I'm the CEO of the Community Environmental Council, and we are here tonight to celebrate CEC's 45th anniversary and to talk about the power that even small cities and small organizations like ours can have. The spotlight tonight will be on Paul Relis, our founding executive director, and his recently published book, Out of the Wasteland. Okay, we have a special treat for you tonight. We have two local filmmakers in the audience. In fact, I want them to make themselves known, Stan Roden and Phyllis DiPicciotto. Where are you? Because I can't see. Right down here, okay. This is the husband and wife dynamic duo. They're filmmakers, and they have made a film about Paul Relis. And we are happy to be premiering part one of that tonight here. And for those of you who don't yet know Paul, this is a great avenue into him and a great introduction. So we're going to run a quick film, and please enjoy.
The message for average Santa Barbarans is if you love this area, like I do, like all of us do, there's a great love of this community, then the message is let's get off oil. We can do that in the next 25 to 50 years in a complete way, be free of this curse.
In '69, we had a big oil blowout, disastrous. I collected tons of dead birds. The grebes took the biggest hit. Not a bird lived, not one. This young guy, he came down and introduced himself to my office. He said, gee, I see what you guys are doing. You know, you really want to clean up the ocean. I said, sure, all I need is a little money. I said, well, we got money flowing in now, so here's $200. I think it was $200. I said, do what you have to do.
To you that after the oil spill, I became a different person. When I started to recite the pros of oil, I went, my God, you know, everything I associate with what I'm about and what I like is fueled by oil. Everything. So I'm going, well, wait a second, you know, you're rebelling maybe against this oil, but to be true to the facts on the ground, you know, you've benefited an awful lot by it. I don't care whether the counterculture, whatever it thought, it was mobile. And to be mobile, you needed oil. Very much a child of my era. I grew up in Long Beach. I liked sports. I liked, college prep, typical kid. I was on the cusp of the revolution that happened around 68, 69 with the shift in values. I lived in a part of Long Beach that had open lands to the north of our property.
He remembered out loud to us when he was a boy growing up in, Long Beach or something. And at first it was just vacant lots down to the sea. That was so nice, running around as a young kid. And then houses came in and that was gone. And then oil wells came in.
I'm in this oil field and the noises are like creaking iron horses. I think maybe many people today haven't been around that, but that's a very special sound, and the landscape was covered with pipes, as an oil field would be, because they're taking fluids here and there and electricity and so forth. So in the distance, I just happened to, something caught my eye, like a dark green area in this otherwise, I use the term desiccated landscape, and I went, I wonder what that is.
And he remembers wandering around in this kind of ghoulish no man's land with the oil and the dripping oil and the machines and the pipes and so on. And yet he found a spot that was kind of a paradise. It was green, and it was a leaking water tank that had created a whole ecology, as it should be, surrounding surrounded by this awful, awful place.
I just found myself gravitating closer and closer to it. And finally, when I got up close, I heard the squawking of red-winged blackbirds, which are especially beautiful. They're blackbirds with very brilliant red colored wings. And I went, oh my. And then I got up closer and there were tule reeds growing, and those are the ones with the little brown ends, and maybe they're 6-7 feet high. And then I saw water below them, and as I looked closer, this whole little magic world came alive. There were mayflies, the blue mayflies skimming the surface of the water, and there were big dragonflies like the red ones, and they buzz, and then as I looked even closer, I realized there were frogs clinging to the tule reeds, and some, were croaking. And anyway, as a little boy, wow, this was pretty dazzling, and made more so by the fact it was in the middle of an oil field, just an awful place, the Badlands.
And right then and there, I think in our living room, he decided then was when he became an environmentalist. And I don't know how old that was, but pretty young. And the thought of that green oasis in the midst of destruction kind of sits with me as a symbol of Paul.
Where the sand dunes were, they dredged all that out. And so no bait, no fishing, no wild place to wander anymore. Right next to our home, they put a big bridge over the waterway, which was as ugly as could be. Those were psychological trauma that a little boy just absorbs. It was all progress and good. Everything that was happening to my world was viewed as an improvement, not something that was to be avoided. And I realized that the connecting point was, it's happening again here in Santa Barbara. I've never been to a place like this. This is so beautiful, and it's so unlike the world I left behind in Long Beach, and I don't want to see that happen to this area. I always laugh at that movie, Being There, Peter Sellers. Sometimes I kind of wonder, when they start listening to you.
In a garden, growth has its season. First comes spring and summer.
Spring and summer?
Yes.
I think what our insightful young friend is saying.
It's kind of funny. We can cut that last point out.
So we're going to talk about launching the environmental movement with Hal Conklin. He's also going to facilitate parts of tonight's conversation, and I will see you in the reception after the show. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Sigrid. And it is truly a pleasure to be a part of this very unique conversation. Well, the conversations that have gone on across time have brought Paul into contact with a lot of remarkable people, not the least of which is Pico Iyer. Over the years, Pico has gone on to become a remarkable writer, not the least of which is the number of books he's written, but also the fact that he has been a major correspondent for Time magazine. In fact, I was amazed when I read in his own bio that 20 of the cover stories of Time magazine were his own stories. So he is going to lead the conversation tonight, and Paul, of course, whom you know and have seen, some of which were here on the screen, will be the one answering the questions. So, will you join me in giving a great round of applause to two great individuals who we hope tonight will provide you with great insight through a great conversation, Pico Iyer and Paul Relis.
Yeah, right. You've had a lot of introductions and preamble already, so probably the last thing you want is more from a Salman Rushdie lookalike who's keeping you away from the Buena Vista Social Club. But it's not often one gets to share a stage with a hero, and especially a hero who's been a good friend for almost half a century. And as I'm sitting here, I can remember so vividly a summer afternoon in 1972 when a wonderful lifelong friend of mine from Kenya, Danson Kiplagat, got me into his really rickety VW Bug, which actually had a hole in the floor, and drove me to this huge office space downtown just 3 blocks away from here, decorated with murals, to meet Paul and Kathy Relis, who were starting an environmental center. And of course, in 1972, none of us had heard of environmentalism. We'd never encountered the word recycling. Nobody had heard about climate change. Earth Day was only just getting going. And I think to a would-be worldly wise 15-year-old visiting from England, which is me, it could seem as if these two bright-eyed, glowing young people from UCSB, 123, 119, were sort of driving their own rickety VW Bug with a big hole in the floor. But Danson knew better, and so did Paul and Kathy. And just as Hal was saying so eloquently, over the last 43 years, I've watched Paul with unwavering determination and also that visionary imagination we were hearing about, become the co-executive director of CEC, really work to protect our beloved Santa Barbara from the wrong kinds of growth, take his ideas right into the state government in Sacramento, and essentially change the world. And I think very soon after I met Paul, I was thinking, just as Hal said, that there were two defining qualities in his thinking. The first was that something that seems completely impossible today, unimaginable, recycling, can become a common feature of everyday life 10 years from today. And secondly, that can only happen if it's undergirded by a really rigorous, practical, realistic sense of what works on the ground, and by a sense of hard work. And so in the 15 years or more in which I've been watching Paul complete this wonderful book, Out of the Wasteland, I've seen him bring exactly the same qualities he's brought to the environmental movement to my field, writing books. The same sense of perseverance, of generosity, and of thoughtfulness. And to me, among so many other things, this book is a really terrific insider's account of the history of Santa Barbara over the last 50 years. But it's also, as important, a global blueprint for the future. And I see a few familiar faces here. Anybody who knows me knows I know about as much about the environment as I know about the mating habits of bonobos or the economic policies of Burkina Faso. So I'm just here to try and draw Paul's wisdom out of him. But if any of you have questions for me about aspects of the world I may know about, of course, I'd love to hear about them in the reception afterwards or in the Q&A period. But I suppose the natural place to begin, Paul, would be in that big office, 15 West Anapamu, 1972. What were you thinking?
Oh, actually, I was thinking about a lot of things. And I guess the core idea was this whole possibility of Santa Barbara and the environment. It just seemed breathtakingly exciting. Like maybe you could create a future. Maybe some young people working with some of the older, wiser people in Santa Barbara could come together and shape a vision for this area that could manifest, could happen.
And I think, I mean, the movie brought out that already at a very young age, you'd seen the possible paradise in California and the possible loss of paradise. And I think you had an unusually powerful vision of the oil spill. Is that right? Did you see it from the air? Or?
I did. Bud Bottoms, who was interviewed in the short film, he introduced me to someone after he kind of passed a little baton to me and said, do what you have to do. I found myself in an airplane, little single-engine airplane, hovering over the oil spill, and the pilot dipped the wings so I could look down, and I saw this cauldron, just like a well, broken well, just blowing up out of the ocean, and it was all black, and I was mesmerized by it. I kept looking down, and it was like looking into the eye of some hellish future. And I said, that is going to change the world. Because we hadn't seen anything like that here at that time. Of course, there have been quite a few oil spills since, and some much bigger.
But you were an English major. You probably hadn't expected your life was going to take you in that direction.
No, I hadn't a clue about being there was no environmental studies department just to qualify things. And so this thing called the environment was not formal. It was to be found in the literature that was coming out at the time, and there was just fantastic literature. The Whole Earth Catalog, Limits to Growth. I was very fascinated by the work of Lewis Mumford, The City in History. Books like these were just so rich and informative, and of course, there was also a lot of fear. We had books like The Population Bomb and Doomsday Scenarios, and it was a real mixed bag. But I found the whole literature, this whole new world, just fascinating.
Because I think among many things, your book is a book of heroes, the mentors and inspirations.
Yeah.
Buckminster Fuller, Ian McHarg. I think there's this great photo of you with Schumacher. And I think it was Schumacher who unexpectedly told you that you shouldn't ignore government or business or the academy. Isn't that right? Yeah.
Well, Schumacher, for those who are unfamiliar with him, E.F. Schumacher wrote a great work called Small is Beautiful. And at the time, I was very fortunate because the head of adult ed had given me, it was exciting times. He thought, well, this environmental thing might bring out an audience, and so you get to invite whoever you want to hear. Whoever you think is important, we'll pay for him. And the privilege was I would get to spend a whole day with the individual. So I spent a whole day with E.F. Schumacher. And he was a giant in his time, an economist from England. And his book was one of the early influences on Jerry Brown, the Small is Beautiful philosophy, which he was poo-pooed a lot for, like Governor Moonbeam, and, can't possibly add up. So he was one of, I would say, the earliest mentors, and what he gave me was a template. He said, to be effective, if you want to build the organization that I think you want, that I'm listening to you say, you have to link economics with the public life, with academic life, and business. And I sort of soberly listened, business? Well, I don't know much about that. And environmentalists aren't very friendly towards business, right? Yeah. So that was a big question mark. But he was such a kind, insightful man that I would say of all the people who I met, and I was fortunate to meet some great human beings, he was the one who set me on my course.
And I think one of the things I love about your book is it kind of explodes all our simplicities or our assumptions. And one of the things that's terrific is that the least likely people suddenly would come to your rescue. Yeah. So on the one hand, Berkeley was not very responsive to your progressive ideas. On the other hand, the head of ARCO was running the largest solar photovoltaic plants around and was eager to explore things. Raytheon, the big defense contractor, gave you some people who helped a lot. And Jim Gilday, after whom the Gilday Center is named, was actually the guy who was responsible for building the Aramco railroad for bringing oil out of Saudi Arabia, and then decided to pledge himself to a post-oil future, as you put it. So again and again, the people you would think were enemies came to your rescue, isn't that right?
Well, I think philosophically, I sort of adopted an attitude, and I think I've shared it with you, and it's in the book. I say, no man is your enemy, no man is your friend. All alike are your teachers. If you have an attitude that just at least recognizes the human element, and that you're never sure, no one should ever be too sure about what they think they know or how people are going to behave. So Jim Gilday was someone who I wish you all could have known. He had, apart from building the Aramco Railroad, prior to that, he was given by the Soviets the Medal of Lenin for delivering supplies through Iran and for World War II. So this is a giant of a guy, self-taught, Leadville, Colorado, heart of gold, here in Santa Barbara, in retirement, ran the West Beach Motor Lodge. And he and I and others became fast friends. And he's someone who lives with me to this day.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's, your epigraph comes from a Scottish mountain climber who says that once you move, Providence starts moving too. And there's this almost magical field of dreams quality about the book, whereby if you build it, they will come. And you started on what could seem a very quixotic dream, and suddenly more and more people were coming and helping you out. Was that sort of how it felt at the time? Or?
I think the mystery of my life, and it remains a mystery, of course, is that if there's one quality I trusted was my intuition. And so I had this philosophy, if I could see something, I could do it. It sounds horribly naive, but I was experiencing very rich imagery. So when we built the farm in downtown Santa Barbara, that was hatched, lying in the grass, spring day, and I just saw this 4-acre site become an urban farm and solar. And when we built the Gilday Center up on the hill, I had a dream that night, and I could just see the buildings, and so it didn't seem like a reach to me. It just seemed like, oh, well, if I can see that, I think I could make it happen.
Yeah, listening to you, just it's beautiful. And suddenly remembering D.H. Lawrence is one of your favorites, and it all makes sense now. But your book could almost be called The Audacity of Youth. I'm thinking that there in that little office, you were putting together a magazine. You had a team that put together a 3-volume, 1,500-page book called The Impacts of Growth in 9 months. I mean, it's just unimaginable. Any sensible person wouldn't even try to do it, but you had the sense not to follow sense.
Well, that was a sort of extracurricular activity that involved Rich Applebaum and Harvey from the university, and Henry Kramer and Jennifer Bigelow. We were these 5 people who were in a room one night at Dick Flax's house, and we were hearing about that the city of Santa Barbara was going to do this plan to say, how big should the city be? And I remember we kind of laughed. We said, well, why should a consultant do that? We should do that. We're smart enough to outline, to study what the future of the city is. Little did we know that we would get the contract to do it. We got a ridiculously paltry amount of money, and we had 9 months to finish. And after all, that was 1974, when university types were viewed with some serious suspicions. in terms of trusting, putting your future in the hands of this eclectic group of individuals. So, yes, it was done in 9 months. It was the most gruesome undertaking, if I have to say. I mean, it felt like being in final exams for 6 months. We would pull all-nighters. We had an army of typists. We had, because we had academics involved, we had an army of undergraduate and graduate students. So we did this 1,100-page, they were using Selectric typewriters then. So a mistake meant it had big consequences.
Yeah. And I literally didn't know till I read your book. They were planning a small 2,000-room hotel on Cabrillo Boulevard, and they were well on the way to turning this into Orange County. And that's what caused you to rise up and protect the town.
Well, I think that morning, it was February. I still can't find the headline for this in the papers. I wanted to include it in the book. But I pick up the paper. Kathy and I were living on De La Guerra then, and it said, banner headline, developer set to go. And it showed a massive rendering of a waterfront that had this huge hotel. They were going to reroute Cabrillo Boulevard behind the hotel. And there was going to be a Ghirardelli Square type. It's 115 acres, as big as the downtown. It had full support of the city council, the labor unions. It was Southern Pacific and Hyatt. And this small little contingent from the east side came in and they said, if this happens, we'll have no more beach. We'll have no more waterfront. It'll be a private waterfront and we won't be welcome. And I remember just feeling this sinking, gut-wrenching sense of dismay because they were looking at us for help. And I was going, oh my God, what could we possibly do to untrack this? And that began a 10-year effort to unwind that. We didn't completely unwind it, of course, but could you imagine Santa Barbara today like that? It would be more akin to Huntington Beach waterfront. Nothing against Huntington Beach, but it's not Santa Barbara, right? So Hal, Bob Easton, Jim Gilday, Selma Rubin, Mark McGinnis, a whole key group of names that everyone should know here, went on the long, rough road of trying to bring it to size.
Yeah. And here we are, saved. Very rough road. And you have a lovely line in the book about how sometimes in the environmental movement, it's easy to have an inflated sense of possibility, which is slightly different from another thing you could say, which is a diminished sense of reality. But it seems to me as how, because they're not the same. I mean, you can have beautiful dreams, but you can also not really be attending to what's in front of you. And Hal was addressing that, I think, in his introduction. And it seems to me that you guys were really starting with the nitty-gritty rather than starting up in the clouds.
Well, for example, Hal keyed off of Stearns Wharf because there was a similar massive proposal that would have transformed Stearns Wharf into a Coney Island type of future. And Hal took that one on early on and took it to the city council when he became a councilman. So, yes, we were practical, I guess. Yeah. Practical sounds pretty prosaic, of course, but that's what we really believed that power lie in the resolution of ideas into what you could really manifest.
Yeah. I mean, practical may sound prosaic, but to me it sounds like Martin Luther King, Mohandas Gandhi, Desmond Tutu, and the Dalai Lama, all of whom are not dreamers. They are the ones who are actually making change on the ground. That's how it happens. And, I think one of the things I got from your book is that at a larger level, it's almost about the management of dreams. Most of us in this room probably issued forth from places like UCSB in the late 60s or 70s, and we had all these dreams, And how do we translate that into real life? And I think that's why we look to you as somebody who's actually made them happen. I mean, you know, I think every year I travel across Japan with the Dalai Lama, 8 hours a day, day after day, and sit in on all his private meetings and his public addresses. And every time he gives an address, somebody stands up at the end and says, well, what do you do if you have this beautiful dream and this vision and it just doesn't work out? And he always looks at them very kindly and he says, wrong dream. In other words, it's not the dream that's let you down. You've let down the dream by not being realistic enough. If you're dreaming of changing the world overnight, being a multi-billionaire, or marrying Brad Pitt, it's not going to happen. But if you are really rigorous in what dream you go for, and actually incrementally, step by step, day by day, which I think was what all of you were doing, then suddenly it's not a dream. It's recycling. It's everything that we know and wonderfully take for granted nowadays that sounded like a dream 40 years ago.
Well, I think the dreams, to the degree that I could envision future possibilities, for me that was food. I found it very creative. I kind of felt, I think Isabel Green, she once invited me to be on a forum, and it was an artist's forum, and I said, what do you have me involved for? I'm not an artist. And she said, well, some of your ideas are kind of like that, but it was nourishment. If I didn't have those dreams and the experience of creativity, I couldn't have sustained myself. So it was a survival mechanism, because I'd watched a lot of the dreams of the 60s, so to speak, evaporate, because it got tough. And if you don't have something to nourish you, that's why basically I started as an activist, but it was fairly short-lived because I wanted to be part of creating the future, not critiquing it. And that gave me the nourishment.
It's such a good distinction, and rather than protesting the system, you changed it. Or took work to change it. Very much so. And I think it's almost as if you had vision in one eye, but very clear-sightedness in the other, because you need really both, as Hal was saying in terms of Charlie Brown and Linus. But,
well, I think the other, I try to bring this up in the book, is that from the very beginning, I wouldn't consider myself an ideological environmentalist. I was kind of a Missouri environmentalist. Show me, if you can show me, maybe the idea has legs. But if it just stays in the ambiguous area, I'm going to be skeptical that you know what you're talking about. So, I mean, it led to probably a lot of experimentation that was more than I needed, more than maybe I wanted. But I think that was a clarifier, because you find out very quickly, say like building a recycling program. Before there was curbside recycling, we did experiments in Santa Barbara where we got some trucks and we put the bins out, and there were people on the staff who tracked what the response was. And so by the time it began to roll out, we said, well, I think it'll roll out this way. And it was more or less on course.
But one has to be tough-minded to deal with a tough reality in some ways. And it's easy to imagine that being tough-minded is the opposite of being tender-hearted. But I think it's the way to be tender-hearted and actually to live up to one's responsibilities, to one's more tender side.
Well, that part, the tough-minded, of course, in my case, I had been working in Santa Barbara 20 years at CEC, and then I had this sort of compelling need, which I talk about in the book, to test myself in a completely different arena. Call it a hostile arena, called Sacramento. And so I was appointed to a board with some people on it who were, we'll say, a bit cynical and a bit calculating and all the things. I felt like kind of Bambi going into that world. I told my wife, after a few days up there, I felt like I'd parachuted in behind enemy lines. It was like, Mama, come get your baby boy. You know, it's like, whoa, this is going to take some getting used to.
Yeah. So you can understand better than most when we watch our president go in with such high intentions but come up against this intractable system.
Well, it's a beast.
Yeah.
And yet, and I hope I can impress on this all of you, I have a lot of esteem that I have towards the political policy process. As negative as it is, all the things are true, but I try to point out that politics, like it or not, is a pod of orcas coursing in the San Juan Straits. It's water running down the stream. It's family. It's an extension of your life as a social being. And you may not like it, but it's there, just like all of nature. And so, in my case, I wanted to learn about it and see what I could do in that world, if I could survive it, if I could get something done. And so I have many friends from that era up in Sacramento. I think a few are here tonight, and it was a great experience, great experience.
Yeah, I often thought, reading your book, of that famous line in Hamlet, there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And you have two long riffs, one about oil, one about politics, saying we're constantly aware of the ways in which politics hurts us and oil destroys us, but without it, as you said in the movie, we couldn't have driven here today. We couldn't have enjoyed some of the benefits we've got. And
That's right.
It's too easy to demonize. And when it goes back to the difference between agitation and action, rather than just say that's a force of darkness, turn it into a force of light and actually see how you can work with it, as you worked with the government itself to turn it, try to turn it in a better direction.
Try to turn it, yeah.
And the other thing that strikes me, when you were talking about moving to a larger arena, Sacramento is certainly bigger than Santa Barbara, but I was also remembering how really in the last 20 years, you've been going to China and Germany and Sweden and Israel and many, many other places. And I wonder how that has changed the way you look at Santa Barbara and the way you look at our country.
Well, I was privileged. First, I went with my wife and my young kids. We spent, this was while I was still at CEC. I asked for a little sabbatical. So a sabbatical for CEC meant you get 3 months off, and good luck. I went to. We all went as a family to China, Japan, and Philippines, and Thailand, and Taiwan, and that was eye-opener because I've been to China 5 times, and so I saw it first as bamboo China. Bicycle China. My son and I rode in the embassy area. It was a sea of bicycles. There were no cars, hardly at all. Still had Chairman Mao outfits. Buildings were bamboo scaffolding. No plastic bags. Just very basic life. Come back. 93, I was a U.S. Information Service to China speaker, and that was whole kind of official thing, but now China was different. Now you saw the first signs in Guangzhou of Deng Xiaoping's statement, it's okay to be rich. Like big banner, communist China, it's okay to be rich. Strange. Then I go back in 97 as an executive with the California EPA, with the Secretary of EPA and the late Chuck Imbrecht, who was our head of energy for the state. And there I see, and the Chinese show us this model of Pudong, which it was all rice paddies then, and they said, in 2 years, this is going to be a corporate city. And we had had enough meetings by then with the Chinese to go, they're probably going to do it. We were humbled. It was like, we've never seen anything like this. And then my last trip which was to Xi'an, China, where the Terracotta Army is, but I was there for a conference. I remember driving in, and there were, I think I counted something, it was night, I think I counted something like 70 cranes. And right next to my hotel, a subway's being built, and they said it'd be built in a year. A whole subway in a year, you know. I mean, these are mind-boggling changes. So, and then to go from there, say, to a country like Sweden, very subdued, very settled, affluent, but very environmental comparison. So this opening up to the world was fascinating to me, because I've always been a student of the urban phenomena, the phenomena that has consumed the globe.
Yeah.
And so you have to see it and experience it.
Yeah. Consumed is the word. I mean, I haven't been to China for 12, 13 months yet now, but the last time I was there, I was standing in the middle of Beijing, which makes, of course, Las Vegas or Midtown Manhattan look 20 years out of date. And remembering being there in '85, as you said, when there were people playing badminton in the main streets.
That's right.
Not even bicycles then. And thinking, this is the great historical development of my lifetime. This is what history will look back on and see as a transformation of the world. But then I was also thinking, people here in this country rightly get so pained now when we think about 9/11 and the 3,000 people who lost their lives there. Many more people die every single day of every year in China just from air pollution.
Yeah.
I mean, the numbers are so large we can't even imagine. But imagine next year, the whole city of New Orleans, Minneapolis, Miami, and Cleveland razed to the ground, every last inhabitant dead. That's what happens every year in China. 1.6 million people dead because of air pollution.
Yeah.
And you know, you hear more and more of these statistics for small particulate haze. 99.9% of the cities in eastern China have a worse situation than a single worst city in this country, which is in California.
Right.
And you can't fail but come up against the costs of progress. And is it worth it? And what are the shadow consequences that we're going to suffer?
Well, I don't think Deng Xiaoping, when he said basically, let's get rich, had a clue. I mean, he was a very smart guy. I've read his, I read all things China. I'm fascinated by it. It's a love-hate relationship. But I doubt if he had any sense of the ecological reality of the future he was projecting. And then it just became like a runaway train. The pent-up entrepreneurial psyche in China just was left to go forth and multiply.
Yeah.
And we've never seen anything like it in the history of the world. Wouldn't you say, Pico?
Yes, and I think the other thing, either he didn't think through or he shrugged his shoulders and decided to accept, was the notion that soon people would realize their third house wasn't making them any happier, their fourth Mercedes was only costing them more and more, and they were lonely and empty. And what happens when you've met all your material needs and you realize you've forsaken all your inner resources in the process? Which, you know, Japan, Thailand, Taiwan, Korea, it's happened in every developing country.
Yeah, the only truly massive failure in China has been this pollution dimension, because in the whole 30 years I've seen it, the air has only gotten worse.
Yeah.
So at least here in California, as mentioned in the book, and I have a picture of Los Angeles in the 50s that looks very much like China today, the air quality. I grew up in the midst of that, got sick after a tennis match, surfing. It was horrible, the air quality, horrible. And look at it, relatively speaking, today. You come back from China, as much as you're awed by it, you go, well, God, look at it, Los Angeles. We put the catalytic converter in. We did, through regulation, through law, through policy, we decided we just didn't want that. We couldn't tolerate it. China's not there yet. They're trying to get there, but 30 years of unremitting horrible air is a price too great. It should never have been permitted.
And isn't it the case, in fact, 27% of the pollution in LA now comes from China?
That's right. And there are all of these incongruities I mention in the book. You know, I have my issues with how recycling has gone, where we ship almost all our commodities over to China and we have no consequence to what happens to them there. And then it comes, but the world's interconnected. We don't get a free ride. The polluted air wafts over the Pacific, and we get it here.
Yeah. And I know you and I were talking a few days ago about how it's a curious state we're in now, where almost every scientist worth listening to has talked about climate change, and we refuse to listen to it. So it's actually fallen to Pope Francis, the Dalai Lama, and Desmond Tutu to speak about them and to make that the central point of their... and I know you were very, very of their platform, as it were, and you were very excited about the Pope's encyclical, which was even subtler than you had imagined,
Yes.
I think.
I don't know how many I thank you for raising that, because that's very big on my mind. How many of you have read the encyclical? Well, small number. I think it may be the most important environmental work that I've ever read. This Pope and his helpers, whoever wrote that, have an uncanny grasp of the situation we're in. And I just love his view that it's about taking care of our home. Now, in the early 70s, when the environmental movement started, there was a symbol. It was the Greek oikos. It related to oikos, which means home. So here's 45 years ago, the environmental movement begins with this symbol and a green flag. And it was, yes, this is our home. So we knew it then, but now it takes the leading religious, spiritual force on the planet to say and propose what the political world will not do. He's the true moral force, and he's not disrespectful of science. He wants to see science work in the cause of taking care of our home. But he's unflinching in his critique, and I am so grateful for him to do that. It was such a heroic, courageous voice in the wilderness.
Yeah. And I think part of the critique comes from his sense that the burden is always borne by the poor of the world.
That's right.
I think there was a Princeton study that 7% of the world's population, the rich 7%, are responsible for 50% of the environmental problems, and the lowest 50% responsible only for 7%. And he links problems in climate change, for example, with inequity, doesn't he? And
He sure does. And that, of course, the environmental movement, and I'm guilty of the same. I mean, the environmental movement is largely white, affluent folks. You know, we haven't connected to the larger world out there. Our world in Santa Barbara, with our friends in the Latino community, and in Los Angeles, although I'm very pleased to see that many of the Latino leaders in the California legislature, this De Leon, major proponent of the bold California legislation, they get it. They get it. And it's starting to be a force. So there isn't this total dichotomy between the working folks and the working poor, and we don't care about the environment. Just a few months ago, I attended a hearing down in Oxnard, and it was over these peaker power plants, and there was just a massive outpouring by young Latino women at that hearing. It was breathtaking.
And you mentioned, I think near the end of your book, a company in Oxnard that's doing all these enlightened things.
That's right.
And the only city that's rivaling it maybe is Lancaster, California.
Yeah, I do get a few licks in the book about this sort of paradox of, now Santa Barbara I love, and it's great. Santa Barbara has not been the focus of my work for nearly 25 years, but I'm back now. I'm semi-retired and writing a book. But one of the great surprises is to think that Lancaster, California, not known as being an environmental bastion of the United States, is maybe Solar City. Huntington Beach is Surf City, and Lancaster is Solar City. I like that. The cities that I'm involved with in my work today are cities like Hemet or Temecula or Costa Mesa or Aliso Viejo, Orange County, Riverside County. Again, not thought of as being on the leading edge, but they're adopting technology that is well ahead of what we're doing here in Santa Barbara.
Yeah, and you mentioned Houston to me recently, too.
Yeah, Houston, it turns out. I just was reading a book about initiatives at the local level. And it turns out Houston is the biggest procurer of renewable energy of any city in the United States. I just love that.
I was doing a few events a couple of months ago with Mathieu Ricard, the Tibetan Buddhist monk from France, who just brought out a 750-page book on altruism. And the slogan at the end is local commitment, global responsibility. But again, it speaks to that sense of everything being interconnected. We're all living the web now. So what's happening in Houston now is going to affect
That's
that.
right. And I mean, my whole story, for what it's worth, is I came here as a student, and I was in awe of the beauty of Santa Barbara. I just thought, this is a dream. You can't live here. This is not a, and it just seemed like if there are actual places like this, then you dig in and you don't let what you didn't like happen, at least not without a fight. You know, if you're going to lose, put up the good fight. But
Are you happy with the way things have gone so far here?
it's kind of a mixed bag, like most of life. I'm happy that we fought the big fights in the 70s that basically preserved the possibility of Santa Barbara remaining a small, relatively small town with a small town atmosphere. I think that's being eroded in different ways. It's not dramatic like Fess Parker's proposed, you know, or Hyatt's, or we don't have a proposed 2,000 home project on the Gaviota Coast. But it's the smaller stuff that gets approved and is changing the character of Santa Barbara. And that I worry about. I think a lot more attention has to be paid. I think there was a boldness that we've lost. Remember the blue line? Okay, this little simple idea that, hey, you know, climate change may be happening. So if it's happening, let's just paint some lines that show where the sea level may come up to. But that was too controversial for Santa Barbara. You know, I used to think, well, isn't it government's responsibility to help protect health, safety, and welfare? Isn't that the core responsibility of government? So if you show a line that says, well, the sea level might be here, what's so horrible about that? People can decide what they want to do. Maybe it'll cause them to do something about not having that line actually be realized. But just erasing the line doesn't get rid of the reality. The reality is the sea level is rising. So don't you have a responsibility to articulate what that might mean for the public?
Yeah. You probably heard that Associated Press, which we think of as the objective voice of reason we look to for dispassionate record of the news now doesn't use the phrase climate change deniers, but calls them climate change doubters, as if climate change is not like the Holocaust or the law of gravity, but is something open to dispute. And they're rightly getting a lot of flack from that. Because if we believe that
That's
climate
right.
change isn't happening, we wait until the deluge.
Well, it just so happened there's someone in the room who gave me a perspective on that yesterday, and I love this. He said, if you were a mountain climber and you went into a shop and you were looking for equipment, and 97% of the experts in the room said, buy this and that, and 3% said, nah, don't buy that. Yeah. Get some funky equipment, and you'll be okay on the precipice. Well, I think that there's a lot of truth in that simple statement. I don't think it's inconceivable to me that this is a debate still. It's not really a debate. It's a debate that's fabricated. It's not a real story. And as I end my book, I was trying to process reading Elizabeth Colbert's The Sixth Extinction, which together with the Pope's encyclical, I think are the two must-reads for our time. Her book may be the most important book on the environment and climate change. But basically, I believe that her perspective and this perspective of the scientific evidence is irrefutable. But if you can say it doesn't exist, and then I heard the other day where the speaker of both the House and the Senate were asked, well, what do you think of climate change? And they said, we leave that up to the scientists. Well, point taken.
Yeah, that's why the Pope has stepped in, I think.
Yeah.
I think I heard that extinction rates are 117 times greater than they should be, or than they have been since the previous extinction. And of course, she begins her previous book, Field Notes for a Catastrophe, by saying humans are not the only species ever to have affected the environment, but we are the only species to be aware of it and to be in a position to change our actions. And yet we've been hearing about climate change since 1979, and we haven't done so much. Except one thing I think you and I are in agreement with is that I have great faith in the individual. In other words, we are told to conserve water. We do. We are told to recycle. We spend many minutes every day sorting out our stuff. It's just that many-legged behemoth that is the government or corporation that is much slower to maneuver. But individuals seem ready to follow the right direction.
Well, I agree with that. I think also we live in a really complex time. I mean, like we said, the story of what's happened to urban civilization. It's exploded. When I was first started UCSB, I think the population of California was 9 or 10 million. It's almost 40 million today in my lifetime from being 18 to my age. And that has meant massive changes, bewildering. I mean, the Industrial Revolution, which I used to teach out at UCSB, and I'd tell the students, if you think things are bewildering now, what if you grew up on the land and then you found yourself in a factory in 1870 or 1890, and you didn't have any contact with the land, you just showed up to the factory? Well, people were hysterical, and the biggest problem was nervous breakdowns from the psychological toll of change. So in fairness to all of us here, it's a tough nut to crack. It's a difficult, complex world that we find ourselves in. So you have to break it down like any complex problem. You have to break it down into manageable insights, manageable pieces. So recycling was one of those pieces, or composting is one of those pieces, or a bikeway is one of those pieces, or a green building is one of those pieces. We can all comprehend those. We can comprehend buying a solar system What we can't do is comprehend climate change. You know, it's just beyond our ken.
And I think we often use this phrase, the global village, because it's inherently soothing. Because a village suggests village elders, people gathered around a village green, the wisdom of the forefathers being handed down to younger generations. But my sense traveling the world is we're living in a global city, which looks kind of like South Central LA, with different tribes fighting it out, rap music blaring for kind of tribal domination of that area. I mean, I was in Mongolia 7 weeks ago, and most of you know this, I think, but not so long ago, people would go to Mongolia in order to see those absolutely pristine, vast sky landscapes, where when you go up to the top of a mountain and you see the retreats that the monks have built, you can look 40 miles in every direction and not begin to conceive of even seeing a human being. And there's nothing but the sound of the wind whistling in your ears. And of course, all of that is still the case. But Mongolia is such a fascinating textbook model for urban studies in some ways, because as probably you all know, the capital Ulaanbaatar now houses 1.5 million people, exactly 50% of the population. It's got Rolls Royces purring outside the concrete blocks, huge Louis Vuitton stores, Tex-Mex rooftop restaurants everywhere, rap music from the singer called G. I mean, it's just pulsing with the highest growth rate in the world. So you have 1.5 million Mongolians living in a version of Las Vegas or Shanghai, and 1.5 million living as in Genghis Khan's, and completely unchanged, although every ger or dome-covered felt tent has a satellite dish and a Toyota outside. But otherwise, they are nomadic pastoralists riding horses and moving every 2 months and following the way of the 11th century. So you have these 2 centuries crushed up against one another. And there's a parable of development. It's who, you know, if you're a 14-year-old kid in the steppes of Mongolia, it'd be hard to resist the seductions of the city. And if you're in the city, it's hard to resist the chance that the old has a wisdom that we're quickly forsaking. Going back to maybe 2 fundamental points. You mentioned in your book that America in the 1970s was leading the world in certain environmental policies, but travels have suggested to you the rest of the world has caught up and sometimes eclipsed us. And that's why I was interested in how and why your travels have changed the way you look on our situation.
Well, Pico, it's completely true that after the oil spill here, you have to remember President Nixon came here, and he came here because he recognized, and his supporters recognized, that in the chaos of the late 60s, if he had any hope of capturing the support of young people, he had to exploit this environmental world. So in short order, US EPA is created. There was nothing like it at that time. Imagine an agency, a cabinet level agency designed to protect the environment. It didn't happen. Shortly after Earth Day comes out of Santa Barbara, Senator Gaylord Nelson is flying back to Wisconsin or Washington, and he's saying, we have to find a way to, again, exploit the young people, and exploit in a good way. So maybe we should have this, a celebration called Earth Day. So in 1970 or thereabouts, the U.S. was the undisputed world leader in looking ahead and saying, we have to deal with the problems of the earth. As a leader, of course, you know, you can easily feel content after a while, and then you lose your place in line. So I had to go to Sweden to discover my world of biogas and converting waste into renewable natural fuel, and Sweden was the undisputed leader. And it was breathtaking to me to see this little country say, we're going to have all our trucks and buses, and maybe even jet airplanes and ships running on the organic waste from our wastewater plants and from our food and green waste, and we're going to convert that into fuel. And it's going to be an engine of our future economy. So that was an epiphany for me. I didn't have that till I went to Sweden. And then Germany is doing comparable work. So there are a lot of exceptional things about America, but in the world we live in today, we should learn from everybody. We really need to become learners as much as doers. You really need to know what Brazil contribute or Mexico contributes to traffic management. You'll even find out that China is going to make some miraculous contributions in the renewable energy future. So why get tunnel vision over this? Join the world, find out what works. Get excited, learn.
I think Sweden and Israel are the leaders in per capita startups. I mean, they're the ones where real new energy is coming. One more question for you before we invite Mayor Conklin back, which is, what are the lessons you think you've learned over your 45 years doing this that you never expected to learn?
Well, since my expectations weren't so large at the beginning, it was kind of like, it's kind of worked out. What a surprise. You know, I managed to be involved with the Community Environmental Council and led it with Hal. And let me say, there are many others. It's crazy to think this was a Paul Relis show. And in order to appreciate that, you need to read the book and you see all the individuals, Mark McGinnis, Selma Rubin, Hal, people you've never heard of, who without them it wouldn't have happened, or a Marianne Mott, who gave us the original grants we needed, without which we would not have survived. So I'm a person who, my life experience says thank you to all the people who touch my life, who live in my life, many of whom are no longer with us, but they live in me, and I hope that I'll live in the young people who are coming.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pico. Thank you, Paul. We're going to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. I'm going to begin with one question to Paul as you come forward to the microphones. Paul, you and I obviously have shared a long history, and I spent a lot of time in local government. In all due respect to my fellow colleagues who are in local government, Santa Barbara over the last 100 years has seen a lot of great people make great contributions to this community and led great causes. I'd have to say you could list double-spaced on a 3x5 card the number of city council members who made a difference. It's not that they weren't good people, but the city government, by its very nature, tends to be a follower, not a leader. The real leadership comes from the people. The real leadership and the power of the democracy of Santa Barbara is in the streets of Santa Barbara. It's the CECs of the world and the environmental defense centers and the homeowners associations and the PTAs and all kinds of social groups, the Rotary clubs, whatever. They're the ones who are the boots on the street. They're the ones who are making a difference. CEC was a great leader of the conversation 45 years ago, because we had the opportunity of the oil spill, which got everybody's attention. What is the conversation that CEC needs to have with the community today about what its future is? Where is Santa Barbara going to be 20 years from now? Or are we stuck in just having conversations about what's going to happen over the next 6 months? Is there a vision bigger than that, and can CEC lead that discussion?
Well, Hal, first of all, going back to, you played a huge role when you were on the council and mayor in some of the great civic enterprises. So you were a leader, and you took what you learned from your time at CEC and you manifested it as best you could in a political, compromised world. That's the nature of politics. Santa Barbara has and the CEC prepared a blueprint 7-8 years ago. I just have to say this, we sold everything. We sold our lovely Guild A Center. We sold the recycling that we owned. We had a house that had been donated to us. John Clark's here, he remembers all that. Why did we do it? Partly because John Clark said, well, the most important issue of our time is to get off of fossil fuel. We should throw all our energies into that enterprise, and we did. We wrote a blueprint. We got the best experts we could, and this is very meager budget, to suggest how Santa Barbara could get off of fossil fuel. That was 7 years ago. We haven't made that much progress, but meanwhile, the state has come on, and now the state of California has established a 50% renewable energy goal, 50%, and almost governor was almost successful in reducing petroleum goal as 50%. So it happens in different ways. The CEC's work is now reflected by many local governments in blueprints and efforts to wean ourselves from the petroleum addiction that we have. Santa Barbara needs to do a lot more. It has to assume its share of the carbon footprint responsibility. And I think CEC, through this proposed community-based aggregation, sometimes I get that term mixed up, is it?
Community choice.
Community
energy.
choice, which would allow the community to essentially establish its own utility and purchase renewable energy from projects that could be built locally and create an economic resource for our community. In our blueprint, we projected that the county could save over $1 billion a year if it goes fossil-free. That was the conservative number. That would mean thousands of dollars on a per capita basis. So this can all be done, but it's always going to begin with the small groups like the CEC or the EDC or some other organization, and it won't at first look reasonable, and it won't look feasible, and people will go, no, you can't do that. I mean, I hate to say it, but that's been my whole life. People just going, I use the term, and it's kind of a joke, but it's not really, finger-wagging certainty. There's nothing like being at the other end of someone telling, young man, if you grow an organic garden, you're crazy and people will starve. If you build a green building, no one will ever buy that building. No one will ever live in it, and it'll be too expensive. All those, I remember those voices. They're like they happened yesterday. They're always there, and I kind of go, well, I guess it didn't turn out that way, did it?
Well, let's open the floor to those who would like to ask questions. We have mics down in the front, so if you'd like to just come up, please just give us your name and then address your question to.
My name is Richard Applebaum. Still crazy after all these years, Paul.
That's right.
First, I just want to thank you for all you've done, and mainly just for being the person that you are. Hal asked the question I was going to ask, which is that Santa Barbara, as you pointed out, was really in the forefront of the environmental movement, thanks to you and the people you mentioned. Now Houston is ahead of us, or Lancaster. So what can we do locally? And all the people in this room share the vision and the hope and the dream that you have. What can we do collectively?
Well, I think the first thing you can do is support organizations like CEC. I mean, it's not an accident what happened. You got to reflect back and you say, what would Santa Barbara be if that organization had never done its work? You've got to come to the truth of it. And you can't just expect that these organizations can do your bidding and you can just be armchair people. You either have to give them money or you give them time, and you give them both. But if you're cheap about it, you know, you can't bring yourself to truly support the engines of change, they can only be so effective. So, yeah, write checks. I'm a bottom line person. Money counts. If you're in a business, you have to be profitable to be able to invest. And if you're in the nonprofit business of ideas and change, you have to have people who'll stand behind you and support you. So support them.
Next question.
Shorter here. My name's Naomi Kovacs, and I was the director of Citizens Planning Association for 9 years. I'm concerned with this Facebook hashtag mentality. We're not going to get the same level of understanding and involvement and concern. So it's one thing to say, I have 100,000 followers who support my hashtag blah, blah, blah. But really going to council and going to the Board of Soups and going to those people, I'm afraid we're losing that. How do we continue to educate the people of those who are involved with citizens planning and CEC and Urban Creeks Council and Environmental Defense Center? How do we get the content-rich people to stay involved? Because the money is one thing, but that is a huge other piece of it.
Well, I'm going to look to Pico Iyer as one of the
Thanks, Paul.
one of the global experts on the information age and its consequence. That's a brilliant question.
It is. It's a very good question. I think you have to speak the language of the times, and you have to use the language of the times to educate people to something more timeless. So I'm all in favor of using Twitter or the hashtag to grab somebody's attention. Once you have that attention, you begin a conversation that opens up larger horizons. And I say that as somebody who, not so long ago, trying to swim against the current, I write books deliberately with very long sentences, completely unreadable, to try and stretch the reader's attention to the breaking point. And although I do that for my own amusement, I realize
You do it well.
well, thank you, but I'm doing it in a vacuum. I'm speaking to myself. So really, if I want to speak to somebody in your generation, I have to use Twitter. And then when we start talking and have an hour together, we're not speaking in 140 characters anymore. But you know, I think not using the language of the times is like going into the middle of Beijing and speaking Greek. It's not going to work.
Next question.
Alan Scholl. I'm currently a docent at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. I can remember back when the oil spill happened, I was a student at City College, and we were watching East Beach every day when we came to school. The tractors were covering up the oil, covering it with sand. And then we heard President Nixon was coming and he might be stopping somewhere on the beach. We were there up on the hill, when he landed, and we yelled, "Dig down."
What did you say?
Dig down.
Dig down.
The oil is down there.
Yeah.
Well, it looked good for him in the press the next day. Many years later, I ran into Rod Nash, a environmental professor at UCSB. He wrote the Environmental Bill of Rights. And I heard again many years later, when he penned that, he asked a friend to take him out to see the oil spill. And when he saw the gusher coming out of the earth, he was inspired to write that Environmental Bill of Rights. And I'm wondering if that has had some resonance with you in your work.
Well, absolutely. And in the book, I have the Environmental Bill of Rights that he wrote. It was a beautiful, timely piece before CEC formally launched, when Mark McGinnis had organized the event at the January 28th committee, and Rod Nash presented the Environmental Bill of Rights at that time. It was a very perceptive, long-range view. All the seed ideas of everything we're talking about here, they seem as, they were well articulated then by people such as he. So yes, they're enduring, but we forget. I'm afraid, the human being has a very fallible memory, and we forget. So I wrote my book in part to remind people of what we're forgetting, including the history of the people who made Santa Barbara what it is today. If we forget those people, we will not be equal to them in the present and the future. They have to remain as living figures, just like great human beings in our history, Thomas Jefferson or Washington or the founders. We have to, they're not just historical figures. Their ideas are living ideas, but they only live through the electricity of those of us here in this room, keeping them alive.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Tom McClintock. I'm dropping down from my pocket borough in the Northeast Sierras. I would like to ask each of you, and possibly Hal, if you have time. Some always used to say, look forward and think younger. If you each look out just 5 years, what would each of you say is the biggest opportunity that we face, and what is the biggest challenge that we face, based on what you've been talking about tonight?
Well, I'll start. I think we're real lucky to live in California. I think we're real lucky to have a governor who has a vision that's so much bolder than what's going on in the rest of the country. It's unbelievable. It's like a separate world. And being in the business of renewable energy, our company, CR&R, we're involved in a very exciting future of greenness. But we're only a piece, let's face it. Nobody has this is a big, big issue. So we can only build pieces. So let's just get busy building the pieces. That's the best advice I can give. It's not a grand vision, just get to work.
And I think the big opportunity of right now is we're more surrounded than ever before in history by more people who are different from us. I just met Paul's youngest daughter backstage, and when you go into her classroom, it's not like a high school classroom 30 years ago. She's able to interact with, befriend, and learn from people from Iran and India and Taiwan and Korea and countries I couldn't have named when I was in high school. The big challenge is that in the face of that, we form our own tribes and retrench ourselves ever more into our own little circles and draw the blinds and lock the door. And I guess a lot of my writing has been about the waste management of the mind, as it were, and the fact that external change only arises from internal cause, and that more people wonderfully are concerned about pollution in the environment, but they don't realize that as long as there's pollution in the imagination or in the conscience, we can't change that pollution. So we have to grapple with the deforestations, the wild spaces, and the climate change within ourselves to begin to bring a reasonable and directed response to the world outside. And there, maybe, I'm in agreement with the previous questioner that the hashtag mentality, if it takes us more and more into the surfaces of the world and away from the depths of ourselves, is going to leave us helpless before the world.
We have time for about 2 more questions before we wrap it up. So we're down here in front. Mark?
Do you think it's possible that our greatest opportunity might be to embrace the religion of Earth? The planet, there it is. I remember at the beginning of the environmental movement, we saw the Earth from outer space for the first time, and for some of us, that was the vision that we can do this. We can see a whole Earth, we can be whole, and we can proceed. The encyclical, is it possible that the only way to counter consumerism, which as I see it is the antithesis of the perspective and the behavior that is needed, would be for us to just say, yeah, without apology, yeah, environmentalism is my religion. I remember people used to accuse environmentalists, boy, you've just got a new religion. Well, you know what? It's time for a new religion. And the Pope is showing the way. Yeah. He's not doing this as a Catholic. He's doing this as an earthling. He is an earthling, and he sees it. He gets it. Your comments, please.
Well, first of all, sort of from the technical side, I was really captivated at a young age by Buckminster Fuller. He wrote the book, wonderful book, Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. And he said in the early 70s, mankind is in control for the first time of the spaceship. And then Elizabeth Colbert comes out with the view that this is the age of the Anthropocene. This is the age of man. If we were to go extinct, it would be recorded. I don't know by who, since no one would be around, but yeah, we have tamed all the rivers, most of the rivers of the world, and we've urbanized vast stretches. There's no argument that mankind is at the controls. It's not clear that it is a control. We're just riding the ship, and the ship's headed to deep trouble. But a religion, when I was a little boy, I was always drawn to the Indians. I loved the Indians in terms of, I didn't dislike the cowboys. I just, when I read these stories of these people who lived and they spoke in certain poetic ways about the earth was a living reality in their lives. And that's what the Pope is saying. You have to care for your home. You can't throw things, discard things all around your home. You can't trash your home and expect to be okay. It's just not possible. Is that a religion? What's wrong with a religion that has as its core the care of the earth? That's what the Pope is saying. If that's Catholicism in his world or it's world citizenship, who cares? Who cares? The question is the message, and can we internalize it?
Just a couple of reflections, thoughts on listening to what you had to say tonight. One is, in your book, Paul, you talk a lot about the people who were mentors to us, the Jim Gildays, the Bob Eastons, the Bob Klausners, all the rest of the Selma Rubens. It was an army of mentors who gave us the wisdom that shaped the future that we were able to pull off. Today I was in a conversation at lunch with people who were involved with lots of environmental students out at UC Santa Barbara. There's an army of people desperately looking for mentors. And there's an army of mentors that are needed in Santa Barbara. People who know how to teach environmental studies, people who know how to make political change, people who know how to bring business to bear on environmental solutions, people who can see global solutions to local problems, people who can bring ideas that people have never thought about to the body politic of Santa Barbara. So I would just encourage everyone here to become a part of an army of mentors to help the next generation do what we were able to do because an army of mentors helped us. The second is, I get the privilege in my life these days to spend a lot of time overseas, a lot of time in Africa. And I was reminded, I think as Mark made mention of the fact that when the Apollo 8 took the iconic picture of Earth from the moon as it made its first trip around in December of 1968, and the astronaut said what a glorious sight it was to see 3 billion inhabitants as one body. That was not 50 years ago, and we're now at 7 billion inhabitants. The world has changed dramatically. Where the environment is hurting the most is not Santa Barbara. As much as I love to deal with issues in Santa Barbara, where it's hurting the most is the poorest of the poor all over this world. And it's hitting them in a dramatic fashion. So I'm an advocate for cities doing everything they can in California to become great, sustainable communities, but I'm urging every city to become a sister city to someplace else in this world that takes what you do here and makes sure the poor don't live at our expense so we can live in a great environment. So Paul, Pico, thank you for this great conversation. And I know there's a lot of people that want to talk to you. I know there's a lot of people who want to buy your book.
I hope
And
so.
there's wine and hors d'oeuvres and great conversation through the door, around to the back, and we invite you to come now back to the reception. Thank you.
Thank you.